It's usually late at night when it hits the hardest. You're staring at your phone, the screen glowing in a dark room, scrolling past names you haven't spoken to in months, and you realize no one is going to message you first tonight. There's a quiet question hiding in that moment. Not, why don't I have friends? But something deeper. Why did it end up like this, even though you never meant for it to? People with no friends are often misunderstood. They're labeled as distant, antisocial, or uninterested. But the truth is rarely that simple. And if you're someone who spends a lot of time inside your own head, replaying conversations, noticing silences, feeling things a little too deeply, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar, because having no friends doesn't usually happen suddenly. It happens quietly. It starts with small moments, choosing not to reply right away because you want to say the right thing, reading a message, overthinking the tone, then deciding you'll answer later, and later never comes. Sitting in a room full of people, but feeling slightly out of sync, like everyone else got a script you missed. Laughing at the right time, nodding at the right moments, but feeling oddly invisible. And somewhere along the way, the connections thin out. What makes this even more confusing is that people with no friends are often deeply aware of themselves. They notice everything. The shift in energy when a conversation changes. The pause before someone responds. The difference between politeness and genuine interest. That awareness can feel like a gift until it starts isolating you. You might remember lying in bed, replaying something you said earlier that day, wondering if it sounded awkward, if you shared too much, or not enough. You tell yourself you're just being thoughtful, self-aware. But slowly, that awareness turns inward, becomes hesitation, then silence, and silence has a way of growing. In the previous video on confidence erosion through small daily self-sabotage, we talked about how tiny, almost invisible habits slowly weaken self-trust. This is one of those habits. Pulling back instead of reaching out, waiting for the right moment, convincing yourself you don't want to bother anyone. Each choice feels harmless, logical even, but stacked together, they build distance. People with no friends often didn't reject the world, they adapted to it. Many of them learned early how to be alone. Maybe they were the quiet one, the observer, the kid who listened more than they spoke, or the one who felt emotions intensely, but didn't know how to express them without feeling exposed. So they learned to keep things inside, to self-regulate, to rely on their own thoughts for company. And thoughts can be loud, especially at night, when the world goes quiet but your mind doesn't. When you scroll endlessly, not really looking at anything. When you think about reaching out to someone, then imagine all the ways it could feel awkward, unnecessary, or unwanted, so you don't. People assume loneliness looks dramatic, crying, obvious sadness. But for overthinkers and emotionally sensitive people, loneliness often looks calm on the outside. You function, you show up, you smile when needed, but inside, there's a constant low-level tension, a feeling of being slightly disconnected from everyone else's rhythm. Have you ever noticed how silence feels different when it's chosen versus when it's the only option? There's also a subtle conflict happening internally. A part of you craves deep connection, real conversation, meaning, and another part of you is exhausted by surface-level interactions. Small talk feels draining. Forced enthusiasm feels fake, so you withdraw. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much to pretend. That's the paradox. People with no friends often feel deeply. They're loyal in theory, thoughtful, attentive, but connection requires exposure. And exposure feels risky when you've trained yourself to analyze every outcome. Sometimes you'll sit in a cafe, watching groups talk and laugh, and wonder how they do it so easily. How they don't seem to dissect every sentence afterward. How they don't go home replaying the interaction in their head. And maybe you tell yourself you just prefer solitude, that you're independent, that you don't need anyone. And part of that is true. But part of it is protection. Because when you've been misunderstood before, or felt like you were too much or not enough, you start editing yourself. You share less. You wait for others to prove they're safe. And when they don't, not because they're cruel, but because they're human and distracted, you retreat further. Unread messages pile up. Not because you don't care, but because responding feels heavy. Because every reply feels like a small performance. And the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to break the silence. This is how people drift into having no friends without ever deciding to. It's not hatred of people, it's fatigue. Another layer rarely talked about is how confidence erodes socially. Not in one big collapse, but through dozens of micro moments. Skipping an invite because you're tired. Avoiding eye contact because you're in your head. Telling yourself you'll try next time. Just like we explored in that earlier video, these small acts slowly teach your brain that staying quiet is safer, and safety becomes comfort. Comfort becomes habit. Habit becomes isolation. Yet even in isolation, there's longing. You might catch yourself imagining conversations that never happen. Rehearsing what you'd say if someone really asked how you were. Feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness when plans get canceled. Wanting connection, but only the right kind. The kind that doesn't require shrinking yourself or explaining why you are the way you are. People with no friends often don't want more people. They want resonance. Someone who understands pauses. Who doesn't rush silence. Who doesn't take your quiet personally. Someone who can sit in the same room without needing constant noise. And because that kind of connection is rare, the waiting feels long. There's also something else quietly shaping this experience. Awareness. When you're highly perceptive, you notice when interest fades, when effort becomes one-sided, when energy shifts, and instead of confronting it loudly, you step back. You tell yourself you're being mature, respectful, and you are. But each step back reduces the chance for repair. Have you ever wondered how many connections ended not because of conflict, but because neither person wanted to impose? The rooms get quieter, the mornings feel slower. You start narrating your own life internally. And from the outside, it looks like independence, strength, calm. But inside, there's a soft question that never quite goes away. Is this who I am, or who I adapted into? The story of people with no friends isn't finished. It's unfolding in pauses, in untyped messages, in glances avoided, in thoughts that never leave the mind. And maybe the real mystery isn't why some people end up alone, but why the most self-aware, emotionally intelligent people often carry the heaviest silence. And maybe that silence is trying to say something, just not all at once. Loneliness that forms quietly doesn't arrive with a dramatic moment or a clear reason you can point to. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come from being rejected outright or pushed away in obvious ways. It grows in the background of ordinary days, hidden inside reasonable choices, subtle emotional shifts, and moments that seem insignificant at the time. You don't wake up one morning and realize you're alone. You slowly adapt to being less connected, and one day you notice the silence has been there for a long time. It often begins with small acts of emotional withdrawal that feel justified. You decide not to share something personal because you don't want to overshare. You hold back a message because you don't want to seem needy. You cancel a plan because you're tired, overstimulated, or emotionally drained. Each decision makes sense on its own. None of them feel like abandonment, but together, they create distance, and that distance becomes familiar. This kind of loneliness is confusing because it doesn't come from a lack of people around you. You might still interact with coworkers, classmates, or acquaintances. You might exchange polite conversations, jokes, surface level updates. From the outside, your life looks normal. But inside, there's a sense that no one is really inside your world with you. You're present, but not emotionally seen. You're involved, but not deeply connected. The quiet nature of this loneliness makes it hard to explain, even to yourself. There's no obvious villain. No single person to blame. Instead, it's shaped by patterns. You notice when conversations stay shallow. You feel when effort isn't mutual. You sense when your presence is optional rather than valued. And instead of confronting these moments loudly, you respond by pulling back slightly. You protect your dignity. You tell yourself it's fine. You adjust. Over time, emotional withdrawal becomes a form of self-respect. You stop initiating as much. You wait to see who reaches out first. You mirror the energy you receive. Again, this feels healthy, balanced, mature. But when both sides are waiting, silence grows. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. And suddenly, there's a gap where connection used to be. This type of loneliness is especially common in people who are emotionally observant. People who notice tone changes. Who sense disinterest before it's spoken. Who feel shifts in energy and take them seriously. Instead of pushing harder to be included, they step back. They don't want to impose. They don't want to chase. They don't want to be where they're barely tolerated, so they quietly remove themselves. There's also a strong link between this loneliness and emotional self-control. People who form loneliness quietly are often the ones who don't want to burden others. They handle things internally. They process emotions privately. When something hurts, they don't make it obvious. They don't ask for reassurance. They assume others are busy, dealing with their own lives. So they stay silent, and that silence gets misinterpreted as independence. The painful irony is that this loneliness isn't caused by a lack of care. It's often caused by too much awareness. You care enough to notice when something feels off. You care enough not to force yourself into spaces where you don't feel fully welcome. You care enough to respect other people's boundaries, sometimes at the expense of your own need for connection. As this pattern continues, loneliness becomes less about missing people and more about missing emotional closeness. You might not crave constant interaction. You might even enjoy solitude. But there's a difference between chosen solitude and emotional isolation. One feels peaceful, the other feels empty in subtle ways. You feel it when you have something meaningful to say and no one to say it to. When something good happens and you hesitate before sharing it. When something painful happens and you decide to deal with it alone. This loneliness also feeds on rationalization. You tell yourself you're just busy, that life is like this now, that people drift, and it's normal, and it is normal. But normal doesn't mean painless. It doesn't mean insignificant. Quiet loneliness reshapes how you see yourself. You begin to internalize the absence. You wonder if you're forgettable, if you're hard to connect with, if you expect too much. These thoughts don't arrive loudly. They slip in gradually, blending with your self-reflection. What makes this kind of loneliness even harder is that it's invisible to others. People assume you're fine. You seem composed. You don't complain. You don't demand attention. So no one checks in deeply. And the less they check in, the more you confirm your belief that your presence doesn't make much difference. Not because anyone said it, but because no one contradicted it. Eventually, loneliness becomes a background state rather than an event. You don't feel sad all the time. You function. You adapt. You fill your time with routines, thoughts, distractions. But there's an underlying sense of emotional quietness. A feeling that something essential is missing, even if you can't name it clearly. And because it formed without drama, without conflict, without a clear beginning, it's difficult to know where to start undoing it. This is loneliness shaped by restraint, by self-awareness, by emotional caution, by repeated moments of choosing silence over expression. It's not the loneliness of being unwanted. It's the loneliness of slowly stepping back from the world until the world stops stepping forward toward you. Overthinking conversations doesn't begin as a problem. It starts as attentiveness. You listen closely. You care about how your words land. You replay interactions not because you're insecure, but because you want to understand them. You want to make sense of tone, timing, and meaning. At first, this feels like emotional intelligence. But slowly, that habit changes the way you approach connection, and the weight of thinking becomes heavier than the act of connecting itself. After a conversation ends, your mind doesn't move on. It stays behind, looping through what was said. You analyze pauses. You question expressions. You wonder whether your words were misinterpreted. A casual comment suddenly feels loaded with possible meanings. You start noticing what you could have said differently, what you should have left unsaid, what sounded strange in hindsight. These thoughts don't arrive as panic. They arrive quietly, disguised as reflection. The more you overthink, the more you begin to associate connection with effort. Every interaction becomes something you need to prepare for, evaluate, and mentally clean up afterward. What used to feel spontaneous starts to feel like a performance you have to manage. You're not just talking anymore. You're monitoring yourself while talking. You're editing in real time. And that constant self-observation creates distance between you and the moment. This distance is subtle but powerful. When you're inside your head, you're not fully present with the other person. You're watching yourself interact rather than simply interacting. You notice how you're sitting, how you're responding, whether you're talking too much or too little. You become aware of yourself as an object in the conversation instead of a participant in it. That awareness makes it harder to relax, and relaxation is where connection naturally forms. Over time, the anticipation of this mental effort begins before the conversation even starts. When a message comes in, you don't feel curiosity first, you feel pressure. You wonder how long to wait before replying. You think about what tone sounds right, friendly but not needy, engaged but not overwhelming. You draft responses in your head. Sometimes you type and delete. Sometimes you read the message and decide you'll answer later, when you have the energy to think clearly. Silence becomes a relief. Not because you don't care, but because silence doesn't require decisions. It doesn't require interpretation. It doesn't require self-monitoring. In silence, there's no risk of saying the wrong thing. No risk of misalignment. No risk of regret. And slowly, that relief becomes associated with being alone rather than being connected. This is how overthinking turns into avoidance without ever feeling intentional. You don't decide to pull away from people. You simply start choosing the option that feels lighter in the moment. And often, that option is not responding, not initiating, not engaging deeply. Each time you choose silence, it reinforces the idea that connection is exhausting and solitude is manageable. What makes this particularly isolating is that overthinking creates a private struggle no one else can see. From the outside, it looks like distance or disinterest. People assume you're busy or detached. They don't see the mental labor happening behind every interaction. They don't know that you care enough to analyze everything. So when you don't respond or initiate, they stop trying as well. There's also a self-reinforcing loop at play. The more time you spend overthinking, the less practice you have with effortless interaction. Conversations feel less natural because you're out of rhythm. And because they feel less natural, you overthink them even more. The mind starts treating social interaction as a problem to solve instead of an experience to share. This pattern is especially common in people who are emotionally sensitive. You pick up on subtle cues. You notice shifts others ignore. That sensitivity feeds your thoughts. You don't just hear what someone says. You hear what they might have meant. You feel the emotional undercurrent of interactions. And when you're tuned in at that level, disengaging feels safer than risking misunderstanding. Overthinking also changes how you remember interactions. Instead of recalling how the conversation felt, you remember what you said wrong, what you hesitated on, what you could improve next time. These memories don't fade quickly. They accumulate. And over time, they shape your self-perception. You begin to see yourself as socially awkward, difficult, or tiring, even if that belief was never confirmed by anyone else. As this belief settles in, your behavior shifts again. You speak less. You listen more. You choose your words carefully. You avoid vulnerability, because it adds another layer of complexity to analyze later. And while this might protect you from embarrassment or rejection, it also limits the depth of your connections. People bond through shared imperfection, not perfectly curated responses. Eventually, the thought of reaching out feels heavier than the loneliness itself. You want connection, but the mental cost feels too high. You tell yourself you'll reach out when you feel more confident, more clear, more prepared. But that moment keeps moving further away. The mind is never fully satisfied. There's always another angle to consider, another potential misstep to avoid. Overthinking conversations doesn't just affect how you talk to others. It affects how you talk to yourself. Your inner dialogue becomes critical, cautious, and rehearsed. You stop trusting your natural responses. You question your instincts. And when you don't trust yourself socially, silence starts to feel like the only safe option.